At 1 minute past midnight on the 15th of February, 1982, a radio operator on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland sends a message that no one had thought would ever be needed. The Ocean Ranger is listing. She wants a rescue. She is the largest semi-submersible drilling rig in the world, 400 feet across, 2 great pontoons the length of a city block, a drilling derrick that stands higher than a 15-story building above the sea. The brochures that sold her called her Unsinkable. The men who worked her were told the same. On this night, there are 84 of them aboard, drilling for oil 200 miles east of St. John's in water that is close to freezing. A storm has been building all day. By midnight, it is a hurricane in all but name. Waves of 50 feet and more are breaking across the deck. Somewhere in the dark, one of those waves has done a small thing with an enormous consequence. It has broken a window. At 1:17 in the morning, the rig radios that the crew are moving to lifeboat stations. At 2:29, the message is that they are abandoning to the lifeboats. And then, before the supply vessels standing by can reach her, before any help can arrive, the Ocean Ranger goes quiet. By dawn, she is gone. All 84 men are dead. Not one is ever recovered alive. The storm did not sink her. That is the finding the record insists upon. A ship built to ride out the worst the North Atlantic could offer was undone by a broken window, a wet electrical panel, and a set of valves that opened themselves in the dark. The question this episode answers is how a rig sold as Unsinkable came to capsize on a routine winter night, and why not one man survived a sea his own equipment was built for. A semi-submersible rig does not float the way a ship floats. It stands on 2 long pontoons held deep below the surface, and on those pontoons rise thick vertical columns that carry the deck high above the waves. In calm or in storm, the working platform is meant to stay level and steady, far enough above the sea that the swell passes harmlessly beneath it. The waves break under the deck, not over it. To hold that platform level, the pontoons are divided into ballast tanks, and those tanks are flooded or pumped dry to keep the rig trimmed and upright. That is the whole principle of the machine. Water in, water out, the deck held flat. The Ocean Ranger's ballast was managed from a single small room in the port-forward column, low down near the waterline, called the ballast-control room. In it sat a console of switches and lights that opened and closed the valves in the tanks below. She was built in Japan in 1976, an enormous and modern rig, rated to work in the harshest offshore waters on Earth. She had drilled off Alaska, off Ireland, off New Jersey. She was classed as a self-propelled vessel and certified for unrestricted ocean service. In the summer of 1980, she came to the Grand Banks to drill in the Hibernia field, the great oil discovery that Newfoundland believed would remake its fortunes. There was a design detail low on that ballast control room that no one thought about much. Set into its wall, 28 feet above the sea, was a portlight, a window. And that window had a steel deadlight, a hinged cover meant to be closed and dogged shut in heavy weather to seal the room against the sea. On the night of the 15th, in a rising storm, that cover was open. The Hibernia field lay on the northern edge of the Grand Banks, a shallow shelf where the cold Labrador current meets the warm Gulf Stream and breeds some of the worst weather in the North Atlantic. Fog, ice, and gales are the ordinary conditions there. In February, the sea runs near the freezing point, cold enough that a man in the water without protection has minutes, not hours. The oil under Hibernia was Newfoundland's hope. For a province that had lived and died by the fishery, that had watched its young people leave for the mainland for generations, the offshore promised work at home and wages that had never been seen. So the rigs were crewed heavily by Newfoundlanders. Of the 84 men aboard the Ocean Ranger that night, 56 were from the province. They were drillers and roughnecks, cooks and radio operators, mechanics and derrickmen. Many were young. Some were fathers of small children. A number came from the same small outport towns, so that when the rig was lost, single villages lost several sons in one night. They worked a rig that the industry and they themselves believed could not sink. That belief was not idle bravado. A semi-submersible is genuinely one of the most stable offshore structures ever built, and the Ocean Ranger had ridden out heavy weather before without trouble. The confidence was real. It was also, the inquiry would find, dangerously close to complacency. The storm of the 14th and 15th of February was a deep and fast-moving low, and it was well forecast. 3 rigs were working the Grand Banks that night. The other 2 took the weather and held. The Ocean Ranger, the largest and the strongest of them, did not. The forensic timeline, reconstructed by the Royal Commission from radio logs and the testimony of nearby vessels, runs like this. Late on the evening of the 14th, seas are breaking high against the columns. At some point around 7 in the evening, a wave strikes the port forward column and breaks the glass of that portlight, the one whose steel cover stood open. Seawater pours into the ballast-control room and washes across the console of switches. This much the Commission established with confidence. What happened next? It reconstructed from the behavior of the rig. The wetted panel begins to misbehave. Its valves, the ones that flood and drain the ballast tanks, start to open and close on their own, driven by short circuits in the salt water. Warning lights flicker without cause. The men in the control room, seeing valves moving that no one has ordered, try to regain command of the system. At around 8 in the evening, they radio the beach that they have water in the ballast control room and that they are working on it. For a time, they seem to have it in hand. But by midnight, the rig has taken on a serious list to the forward end. Water has flooded into tanks on one side and cannot be pumped out. To correct such a list, the crew would have to bypass the ruined electrical console and operate the valves by hand through a manual backup system built into the rig for exactly this failure. Here, the chain reaches its worst link. When the Commission examined the manual system, it found that the crew had almost certainly never been trained to use it, that the tools and instructions for it were inadequate, and that no one aboard fully understood how the ballast system worked in the first place. The manual rods in the flooding dark were not a workable answer. At 1:17 in the morning, the rig calls the men to lifeboat stations. At 2:29, she reports that she is listing badly and the crew are going to the lifeboats. Minutes later, a garbled transmission speaks of men in the water. And then, nothing. The supply vessel Seaforth Highlander is standing by, close at hand, in 50-foot seas and a wind near 100 miles an hour. Her crew see a lifeboat in the water with men aboard. They maneuver alongside and try, again and again, to bring the men in across the gap. In that sea, in that cold, they cannot. The lifeboat capsizes. The men are lost within arm's reach of the ship that had come to save them. When the search planes and vessels reach the site at first light, the Ocean Ranger is gone beneath the surface and the sea holds only wreckage. Canada and the province of Newfoundland convened a royal commission, and it sat for 2 years. Its report is a study in how a disaster is never a single failure. It is a sequence, and at the Ocean Ranger, every layer of protection failed in turn. Consider what standard practice required, and set against it what was aboard the rig. The rule of safe design required that a critical control space near the waterline be sealed against the sea in heavy weather. That was the purpose of the deadlight over the portlight. Aboard the Ocean Ranger, that cover was open, and one wave was enough to flood the room. The rule required that a ballast control system be robust against a wetting, or at minimum, that its failure be safe. The Ocean Ranger's console, the Commission found, was vulnerable to seawater and behaved unpredictably when wet, opening valves that should have stayed shut. The rule required that any crew operating such a system understand it fully and be trained on the manual backup for the day the automatic system failed. The Commission found that no one aboard fully understood the ballast system and that the crew were effectively untrained on the manual method that was their last defense. The rule required lifeboats that could be launched and survived in the conditions the rig was certified to work in. The Ocean Ranger's boats could not be safely launched into a Grand Banks winter storm and offered little protection once in the water. The rule required that men going into near-freezing water have survival suits, insulated immersion suits that buy a body hours instead of minutes. There were not enough survival suits aboard, and in the speed of the capsize, the men could not reach them. Most went into the water in ordinary clothing, and the rule required a standby vessel able to recover survivors from the sea. The Seaforth Highlander was there and willing and could not do it because no vessel of her kind had the equipment to lift living men from a 50-foot sea. 6 barriers, every one of them down. The Commission's conclusion was blunt and has been quoted ever since. The men of the Ocean Ranger did not die because the storm was beyond human endurance. They died because of a chain of design faults, regulatory gaps, and failures of training and preparation. The disaster, in the Commission's judgment, was one of institutional neglect as much as of weather. The Ocean Ranger is one of those disasters that becomes a hinge. The offshore industry that operates today in Canada and far beyond it was shaped in part by what the Commission found on the Grand Banks. Survival suits became mandatory, carried for every person aboard and stored where they can actually be reached. Ballast control systems were redesigned and their operators retrained, with the manual backup treated as a skill to be drilled, not a diagram on a wall. Standby vessels were required to carry proper rescue craft and recovery gear, so that a ship standing by is a ship that can act. Evacuation systems were rethought for the reality of a rig capsizing in a storm at night. And in Canada, the regulation of offshore drilling itself was rebuilt with an independent safety regime born from the Commission's recommendations. None of it came in time for the 84. That is the shape of maritime safety. Almost every rule that keeps offshore workers alive today was written after men died for the want of it. Every year, on the 15th of February, Newfoundland stops to remember. In St. John's and in the small towns that lost their sons, services are held and the names are read. 84 of them, 56 from the province, some of them from the same few streets. They were, most of them, young men who had gone to the new oil rigs because the rigs were the future, and because the future was supposed to be safer than the fishery their fathers had drowned in, they were told the rig could not sink. She sank in a single winter night, and the sea, in the end, took the brochure at its word. The Ocean Ranger has a companion in this catalogue. 7 years earlier, the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald went down with all 29 of her crew in a November storm on Lake Superior, another cold water loss with no one recovered. That investigation is the next file in this record.